Reality wants to be spherical, wants to be symmetrical, because that's the most graceful shape in which energy flows. Rocks in a stream naturally tumble towards roundness. Human beings naturally grow towards roundness. What interferes with this process are paradigms, synthetic concepts of human culture that create asymmetrical shapes that elongate the sphere. Now, the more asymmetrical the energy flow, the more elongated, the more rigid and shaped, the more pain is generated, because pain is the separation from and longing for beauty, truth, goodness, wholeness, that which integrates us with our world. So when you have paradigms that facilitate this, when you have structures through language, through consciousness, through culture that facilitate wholeness, a balance of heart, mind, and body, a balance of masculine and feminine, a balance of inner and outer, a balance of going down and going up, doing the shadow work within as well as the ascension, but that which is both subhuman and transhuman. When we go in these multiple directions simultaneously, we create a symmetry, a wholeness, a spherical cycle. Now, the shapes that human beings create are never perfect, so we never have a perfect whole. It's a movement. Now, the problem comes when we create a painful shape, meaning it's easy for energy to run here, but then when it goes to make this turn and come back up the line, it's much more difficult than energy that runs around in a circle. The problem at this point is the friction, the pain generated by the shape. Now, all you have to do to move towards grace is to notice where the circle has been elongated and move in the direction of wholeness, which is similar to the direction of healing the blocks in the energy. Now, there's an interesting paradox because when all of the blocks are resolved, then you come back to wholeness. Everything is restored. Everything is whole. Everything is healed. But if you have an agenda that precludes that movement towards wholeness, and one of the biggest agendas tends to be avoiding conflict with the culture around us, then the first step is to deny, meaning the circle is scrunched down into a shape like this, or into a watermelon like this, or even worse, into a narrow line. And this creates a lot of pain. But rather than dealing with the pain created by the shape, there's denial, which is the fear. Denial equals fear. Because if you're in a certain amount of pain and discomfort, in an awkward shape, and someone says, "What are you feeling?" or, "How could we change things to be more whole?" The obvious response is to diagnose, etc., and respond. But if for some reason you do not believe it is possible, as an example of a faulty belief, or that the conflict that it will create with a relative is too great to actually facilitate the restoration to wholeness, then denying that there is a problem can provide some temporary relief. So the first step in responding to an asymmetrical structure is denial, expressing the fear as a coping mechanism to avoid dealing with something. The second step, which is a little healthier, is acceptance, which is you say that this is not a circle. It is an odd, somewhat cumbersome shape that may be better than nothing, certainly better than not existing, but is, in fact, an awkward shape that creates pain. The third step towards health and wholeness is diagnosis. That's where you take the shape and you say, okay, this is pretty good. If we elongated this, if we shifted like this, if we moved like this same shape could be spherical, could be symmetrical, could be balanced. And so we then diagnose the gap between the shape and the circle. Now, the fourth step as we move towards health and healing is the response. Meaning, once you say that this point here is an inch away from the circle here, and so we want to move this point over to here, and with it take a lot of this energy over here into it closer to a spherical shape. And we want to pull this point 1.5 inches over. Once you start doing this, then healing is taking place. You are restoring the system to wholeness. And the fifth step in this process of healing is assessment. How does it feel now? If the body is like this and comes out into a shape like so, how does it feel now? It's a monitoring process, which is an update of the diagnosis to say, okay, now we're only 0.5 inch away from the optimal spherical wholeness. Now this bit is only 50% as bad as it was before. And there's an adjustment process. There is a cost to change. There is a cost, and it's an investment. If you were to take a bent bicycle wheel that's squashed into a watermelon shape, every single step you took on that bicycle would be hell. You'd probably rather walk, because your 2 feet are in the way that the walking motion and leaning in occurs actually symbolizes the circle. So you lean into the circle, this foot becomes this foot becomes this foot. And so walking is, in a sense, turning the body into a sphere, just moving forward. Rather than being spherically shaped, we lean in and the feet become part of the spokes of the wheel. So you have assessment. Then you have repeat. So the next process is repeat. Acceptance of the new shape. And just to complete the bicycle analogy, to take a bent wheel and push it back into shape takes energy. You have to take off the wheel. You have to assess what is the optimal spherical shape. You have to put pressure to push the wheel back into a circle. And then you assess and maybe do some hammering, etc. And all of that takes work. It takes energy. If you're hammering at the, on the rim of the wheel, etc., it creates some pain in the noise. It takes some real effort. You might need some help to bend a wheel back into shape if the steel is strong. You may need to heat the wheel up. to get it to become more liquid, which in the equivalent on a psychological level is flooding the system with emotional heat. Emotional intensity is the equivalent of heat. So the more intense we are emotionally at a given moment, the easier it is to come back into shape, because intense emotion liquefies the structures. This is one of the reasons why so many of us are bent into such horrible shapes, is that much of our shaping in our culture occurs during traumatic moments. So the heat of intense panic, of intense fear, of overwhelm liquefies the system, and then an abusive or unregulated energy slams in and does not honor that sensitivity. And then the system goes into freeze and cools down, and suddenly we've got a watermelon-shaped bicycle wheel. So the repeating of this process is the repeat. The acceptance of the new shape, the diagnosis of the new shape, the response to move closer to symmetry, the reassessment, and then the repeat. Now, the last step in the cycle of healing is grace and symmetry. Now, once a process returns to grace and symmetry, in many ways it becomes unconscious again. You know, when you have a beautiful flowing conversation, you don't diagnose all the things that feel terrible. When you have a terrible conversation, you ask, could I have some water? And the other person doesn't register that you've spoken. Well, that's not much of a starter. So you ask for a glass of water, the other person doesn't register that you've spoken. Their face doesn't move. They don't say anything. And you then say, are you busy? And they say, which, you know, isn't saying much. What does that mean? They don't want to hear what you have to say, you know, whatever. And you say, can you answer my questions? And they glare at you and say, da, da, da. Well, you can diagnose this forever because it's a very asymmetrical, unconscious, ineffective flow of energy. What we're looking at is not only the return to the sphere, but the spherical movement towards grace, the embodiment of intelligence, the efficiency with which energy transforms into human well-being. And so when that happens effortlessly, and there's just a warm, fuzzy feeling because this flows nicely, we're in a nice situation, you know, the temperature is good for my body, I've got the right amount of workload for my body, I'm doing something I'm relatively competent to do, what I'm doing balances out my system as opposed to increases its toxicity, etc., etc. It's a great setup, you know, and so you know, we can continue symmetrically. So in this you know, in this process, it's important to know that as you do healing, it requires attention, energy, and sometimes discomfort to restore symmetry to the wheel. But you use this guide. You use this guide of symmetry. If you have a triangle, such as heart, mind, and body, it's obviously a pretty simple system. But as long as you keep the points equilateral, and you understand that there's a lot of unspoken energy that is in between, that there's a synergy of that which is in between heart, mind, and body, and that ultimately it's that circle. The mind is simplifying it into a triangle because the mind has a difficult time grasping complexity without the technology of writing and computers and various things like that. So we have a difficult time saying, you know, 3,000 points in the circle. So we simplify it, heart, mind, and body. But there's really dozens and dozens of distinct points on each of those, and then there's the intersecting points. That's how they flow together into the circle. But once you do a simplification, you're like, how masculine am I and how feminine am I? How much do I honor the masculine side in me and how much do I honor the feminine side in me? Does the feminine side in me honor the feminine side in me, and does the feminine side in me honor the masculine in me? Well, that's a pretty good framework if you understand the core nature of polarity. You can build through and say, this part of my masculine energy shames this part of my feminine energy. This part of my feminine energy has dissociated between this part of my masculine energy. Aha. There's the diagnosis to start unraveling and getting to the core pain, which is usually traumatic memories that have knocked some part of the psyche out of shape at a moment of intense feeling, which has then cooled off and crystallized into an asymmetrical and distorted shape. And it's kind of like, if you can imagine, the pleasure of driving. And most of the curves are, in the road are nice radiuses. But then you come to this one really awkward corner. And if you don't completely stop the car, you'll spin off the road there. You got to stop, turn the wheel hard, back up a little bit, and then go here. Otherwise, you can't make the corner because it's such an awkward shape. And so there's going to be a lot of accidents at that point in the road. So if we were diagnosing the pain of the traffic system, we would take the most awkward blind corners where people could normally come along at high speeds and then they'd hit this corner. They'd have to turn, sharp left, sharp right, and then other people rear end them at that point because it demands, the fault in the design demands a lot of special attention, disproportionate, and it's not even in scale. It's not like it requires twice the attention. You come to this one area of the road and suddenly if you're not 10 times as conscious as you were a minute ago, you have an accident. And so this is a paradigm for measuring energy flow in the body, in the heart, in the mind, in life, in ecology, and a process of continually moving towards partnership, towards synergy, towards greater complexity and grace in our relationship with our environment, in our relationship with ourselves, in our relationship with our partners. And it's a challenge because when you meet someone who is in a shape like this, and their natural and healthy shape is like this, you may have, if you're connecting in a healthy way, you may have a very thin connection. But if you meet them here, or you may be pulling them out into being, more, quote, well-rounded out here. And it can be difficult to honor the potential for wholeness in someone who, for example, first traumatically crystallized into a very oblique set of angles, a very asymmetrical set of angles, and then identified. When you're traumatized, you look for something stable, and if you don't have any stable, safe connections around you, you identify your self-image on something that is stable, which could be the new identification with the disease, the self-concept that forms around the new shape that is unhealthy. And as we do that, then we protect our self-concept, our self-image, our new shape from influence, because we're protecting ourselves from the unknown. And it's ironic that the fear of the unknown stems from the fact that unregulated traumatic energy pulled us out of shape to begin with. And then, having pulled us out of shape, we crystallized our attachment to the new synthetic identity, the new adaptive personality. And then, having found stability in the new shape, because having cooled down, it's holding its shape. It's very difficult to move forward in that shape, but it's holding it. Now, we're very afraid of the unknown melting that shape again, even though the melting could bring us back to a more spherical shape. Thanks for watching.